The question of how much fish should there be in the ocean is the subject of this video and is going to be your main concern as a fisheries manager. And really, it depends on what we want. Do we want to be able to use the fishery, or do we not want to be able to use the fishery? So essentially, if we're going to fish, we can, or if we're going to look at a resource, we can keep it for completely untouched for tourism and looking at, taking photos of, enjoying, and knowing that it's there. If we try fishing, then we're going to, if we fish, if we remove organisms from the environment, then we're going to alter the balance of nature. So do we want it to be preserved exactly, or do we want to be able to use the resources to enjoy our fish and chips on the beach? So as fisheries managers, we need to, and actually as human beings, we need to come to terms with the fact that if we extract resources of any sort, including fish, then the population of that extracted will be lower than the carrying capacity for wild populations, of course. So you'll come against this graph in ecology. This is called an S curve, and it describes the growth of a population. And with this graph, a small amount of yeast was inoculated onto petri dishes, and the amount of yeast in milligrams per cubic centimeter was measured every hour or so, and this was measured for 20 hours. So you can see at the very beginning, with just post the inoculation, there was next to no yeast in the petri dishes. But as time goes by, yeast, which is a bacteria, rapidly increases. It rapidly reproduces, and it reproduces very quickly to the point where it reaches the point where there's the food resources are used up, and so with competition, there's not enough food to continue for the population to continue to grow. And at the beginning, you can see that the growth is back from the 0 to 2 to 4 area. The growth is slow because there aren't as many mature reproducing individuals to increase the population quickly. But as more offspring start reproducing, you can see the growth rate accelerates, and at the inflection point, that's where the growth is at its maximum point. And then through competition for resources, the growth will start to decelerate and then steady off, will level off, and that is called the carrying capacity. That's where the population is at its maximum amount that the resources can sustain. And the maximum sustainable yield, which we'll go over in class, is the point at about half of the population at the inflection point where the growth is the fastest. So if you want to increase the amount of fish being produced or if you want to keep the population where the growth rate is the highest, you don't necessarily want the population at the carrying capacity, because they're putting a lot of their energy, rather than into reproduction and growth, they're putting it into competing with one another for resources. So we'll go over this in class, but remember that what you should take from this is that with very little effort, and that can be measured in number of vessels or many other ways to measure it, there's going to be very little catch, And as you continue to add effort, at some point you'll reach a catch, which is the highest you can sustainably catch. So if you catch it for, if you assume that time is irrelevant and that you've reached equilibrium at any point on this graph. So if you have 0 vessels at the beginning, and at MSY 5 vessels, and the same distance along at the end where close to where the yield is, it says it's 10 vessels. If you add more than 5 vessels, your catch is not going to go up, it's going to start going down, because you are cutting into the amount of, you're overfishing, you're cutting into the amount of adults that are able to reproduce. So this population, this graph describes a population decline with increased fishing pressure. And so if you have very few boats down near the 0 point, then your population is going to be near carrying capacity. Okay, so the percent of virgin biomass, if it's 1, then you have 100% of the virgin biomass, and that is carrying capacity. But if you increase your fishing effort, you're going to lower the population because you're removing more individuals, and eventually you'll get down to a very small percent of the virgin biomass. Okay, and virgin biomass will be defined as the amount of fish or the amount of organisms. It's usually in weight. Well, biomass equals weight of an unfished population. So how big would the population be if it was unfished? That's the percentage of that's the virgin biomass. So right now at the Bay of Plenty with snapper, we're at about 6% of the virgin biomass. So we're way over on the right-hand side. We've way overfished the stock in the Bay of Plenty for snapper. So if we put them all together, where does the population grow fastest, i.e., where do we get the most yield? It grows fastest at the inflection point on the S curve. It grows fastest at the maximum sustainable yield. That's where we can take the most fish out of the population. But where does it grow the fastest on the third graph? Is it right there in the center, or is it more at one of these other points? Can we drop the population down to below half, or do we need to keep it up above half of the virgin biomass? Okay, so that is essentially the question of fisheries management. Where do we get the best yield? Where are we going to be able to extract the most fish to feed people and to make money? Well, that depends on how fast the population grows and reproduces. So let's consider one type of fish, the anchovy. And if we look at this graph, you can see that this was a sample of the population that was caught. So this is essentially taking a bunch of fish from that were caught in a sampling event. So that could have been a trawl or well, most likely a purse seine with the anchovies, and looking at the length of those fish, and or the otoliths, which we'll talk about in a second, but or possibly scales. But anyway, these fish were aged, and so about 1% were born in July 2007, and then the next week along, or the next 2-week period along, about 1%, and then 2%, and the next column, back to 1%, 3%, 6%, 7%. And you can see that if you add up all of those columns, you'll get to 100%. So all of the catch was hatched between July 2007 and December 2007. So you can see that the anchovies have 2 major spawning events, and they spawn almost throughout the whole year, from July to December. So about, well, it's not throughout the whole year, but 6 months of the year they spawn. And they spawn in great numbers. They feed on plankton, so they feed low on the food chain. They grow to sexual maturity in 1 year, and each female can produce 10,000 to 20,000 eggs. So, with a very fecund, which means organisms that can reproduce a lot of offsprings, um, and they reproduce them very quickly, um, with an with organisms like this, okay, you can produce, you can reduce the population to 25% perhaps of the virgin biomass without greatly sacrificing the reproductive potential. They can rebound very quickly from heavy fishing pressure because they reproduce heavily and they produce lots of offspring. Let's consider the orange roughy, though. By using something called an otolith, which is a bone that's taken out of the essentially the ear. There are two of these on either side of the skull. You can cut these into in half along that line that's shown, and count the rings like counting the rings of a tree, and you get the growth, and each of those will signify a period. Might be a year, might be less time, but it's a growth period. And so you can count those and you can figure out how old these things are. Now, some orange roughy will live to 150 years, so they're very long-lived. They feed on nekton, so that means that they're not feeding on plankton. Well, they're not feeding on phytoplankton. They're not feeding on on primary producers. They're feeding on secondary, third level consumers, squid and the like. And they don't sexually mature for 25 years, so they take a lot longer than humans to even reach sexual maturity or puberty. And so they produce 22,000 eggs per kilo of body mass. So a 5 kilo orange roughy will produce something like just over 100,000 eggs, whereas the anchovy, which weighed a few, maybe a couple hundred grams, would produce 20,000 eggs. So these things have roughly 10% the average fecundity of other species. They're slow growing, slow reproducing fish. So you might only be able to reduce the population to 75% of the virgin biomass without greatly sacrificing the reproductive potential. Now, with some of these, we've reduced them down to 2 and 3% of their virgin biomass, some of the populations around seamounts. So let's review. All right. Fisheries managers will try to reduce the current biomass of a stock to increase production. All right. It may seem counterintuitive, but there is a point where you can have too much fish to maximize your production, because those fish, rather than putting their energy into growth and reproduction, start putting their energy into competing. Unfortunately, though, we often don't know the virgin biomass because a fishery has been fished, most fisheries have been fished since before we started measuring the catch. It's also very difficult to know what would have been there, or even if we have an unfished population, to know how big it is, because it's hard to see them. They're underwater. The amount of the reduction is often debated and contentious. So on the one hand, we may have one group of fishers or scientists that are saying we can reduce the population to 20% of the virgin biomass. And another group will say we can only reduce it to 45% of the virgin biomass. And who's right? Well, they'll keep pointing out different information to support their point, and often in that time while it's being debated, the fishery is it's very hard to pull back the effort. And we also have to remember that there are whole ecosystem effects on other species by reducing the current biomass of a stock. So if you do reduce the anchovies and sardines of the Peruvian fishery to 15%, the large populations that were supporting big populations of seabirds and tuna um, might not be there, in which case you can have tuna and seabirds not being able to feed themselves. So we have whole ecosystem effects. No species lives in isolation. Again, and again, we have to remember that if we're going to fish, we are going to reduce the biomass of a stock. You cannot keep the balance of, you cannot keep the population at carrying capacity and have any significant consumption of that stock. We can reduce the population size of fast-growing, highly fecund fish stock to a lower current biomass than a slow-growing, low fecundity fish stock. Just go back and review the anchovies versus the orange